1. Any integer is divisible by 1. 2. The last digit is even. That is, the last digit is 0, 2, 4, 6, or 8. For example, 2562, 5488, 9634. 3. The sum of the digits must be divisible by 3. For example, 4137. For plus 1 plus 3 plus 7 is equal to 15. If it is not obvious that 15 is a multiple of 3, you can keep repeating the process. 1 plus 5 is equal to 6. Alternatively, subtract 2 times the last digit from the rest. For example, 468. 46 minus 2 times 8 equals, 46 minus 16, equals 30, which is 3 times 10. 4. The last two digits form a number that is divisible by 4, i.e. ignore everything from the 100s up. 145364 is divisible by 4 because 64 is divisible by 4. Alternatively, the sum of the 1's digit and double the 10's digit is divisible by 4. 32152 is divisible by 4 because 2 plus 2 times 5 is equal to 12. Alternatively, if the 10's digit is even, the 1's digit must be 0, 4, or 8. If the 10's digit is odd, the 1's digit must be 2 or 6. 5. The last digit is 0 or 5. For example, 1630, 8525, 9745, 146010. 6. Test for 2 and 3. 5346 is divisible by 6 because its last digit is even, so it is divisible by 2. And 5 plus 3 plus 4 plus 6 is equal to 18, so it is divisible by 3. Alternatively, sum the 1's digit, 4 times the 10's digit, 4 times the 100's digit, 4 times the 1000's digit, etc. For 5346, 4 by 5, plus, 4 by 3, plus, 4 by 4, plus 6. Equals 20 plus 12 plus 16 plus 6 is equal to 54. You can repeat this till you're sure. 4 by 5, plus 4 is equal to 20 plus 4 is equal to 24. 4 by 2, plus 4 is equal to 8 plus 4 is equal to 12. 4 by 1, plus 2 is equal to 6. 7. Add 5 times the last digit to the rest. Example 476, 47 plus 5 by 6, equals 47 plus 30 is equal to 77, which is a multiple of 7. Alternatively, subtract 2 times the last digit from the rest. Example 476, 47 minus 2 by 6, equals 47 minus 12 is equal to 35, which is a multiple of 7. Alternatively, adding the last two digits to twice the rest. Example 476, 76 plus 2 by 4, equals 76 plus 8 is equal to 84, which is a multiple of 7. 8. The last three digits form a number that is divisible by 8, that is, ignore everything from the 1000s up. 258152 is divisible by 8 because 152 is divisible by 8. Alternatively, the sum of the 1's digit, double the 10's digit, and 4 times the 100's digit is divisible by 8. 32152 is divisible by 8 because 2 plus 2 by 5, plus 4 by 1, equals 16. Alternatively, add the last digit to twice the rest. The result must be divisible by 8. 152, 2 plus 2 by 15, equals 32, repeat until you're sure. 32, 2 plus 2 by 3, equals 8. 9. The sum of the digits must be divisible by 9. For example, 5337. 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 7 is equal to 18. Alternatively, add the unit's digit to the rest. 5337, 533 plus 7 is equal to 540. You can repeat until you're sure. 540, 54 plus 0 is equal to 54. 10. The last digit is 0. For example, 3620, 59130. Alternatively, test for 2 and 5. 11. Form the alternating sum of the digits. That is, starting from the left, subtract and add every other number. The result should be a multiple of 11. Example: 613261, 6 minus 1 plus 3 minus 2 plus 6 minus 1 is equal to 11. 918082, 9 minus 1 plus 8 minus 0 plus 8 minus 2 equals 22. Alternatively, subtract the unit's digit from the rest. 605, 60 minus 5 is equal to 55, which is a multiple of 11. 12. Test for 3 and 4. Or subtract the last digit from twice the rest. The result must be divisible by 12. For example, 348. 34 by 2 minus 8 is equal to 68 minus 8 is equal to 60, which is 12 times 5. 13. Add 4 times the last digit to the rest. Example. 611, 61 plus 4 by 1 equals 61 plus 4 is equal to 65. You can repeat until you're sure. 65, 6 plus 4 by 5 equals 6 plus 20 is equal to 26. 14. Test for 2 and 7. Alternatively, add the last two digits to twice the rest. The result must be divisible by 14. For example, 826. 8 by 2 plus 26 is equal to 16 plus 26 is equal to 42, which is 14 by 3. 15. Test for 3 and 5. 16. The last four digits must be divisible by 16, that is, ignore everything from the 10,000s up. Alternatively, add the last two digits to 4 times the rest. The result must be divisible by 16. For example, 352. 52 plus 4 by 3 equals 52 plus 12 is equal to 64, which is 16 by 4. 17. Subtract 5 times the last digit from the rest. Example. 391, 39 minus 5 by 1 equals 39 minus 5 is equal to 34, which is a known multiple of 17. 18. Test for 2 and 9. 19. Add 2 times the last digit to the rest. Example. 285, 28 plus 2 by 5 equals 28 plus 10, which equals 38, a multiple of 19. 20. The last two digits are 00, 20, 40, 60, 80. For example, 5220, 7680, 3240. Alternatively, test for 4 and 5. Test for 3 and 7. Alternatively, subtract twice the last digit from the rest. For example, 357. 35 minus 2 times 7 is equal to 35 minus 14, which is 21. 22. Test for 2 and 11. 23. Add 7 times the last digit to the rest. Example. 575, 57 plus 7 by 5 equals 57 plus 35 is equal to 92. You can repeat till you get an obvious multiple of 23. 92, 9 plus 7 by 2 equals 9 plus 14, which is 23. 24. Test for 3 and 8. 25. The last two digits are 00, 25, 50, 75. 26. Test for 2 and 13. 27. Subtract 8 times the last digit from the rest. Example. 351, 35 minus 8 by 1 equals 35 minus 8, which is 27. 28. Test for 4 and 7. 29. Add 3 times the last digit to the rest. Example. 725, 72 plus 3 by 5 equals 72 plus 15 is equal to 87. You can repeat till you get an obvious multiple of 29. 87, 8 plus 3 by 7 equals 8 plus 21, which is 29. 30. Test for 2, 3, and 7. Or. Test for 3 and 10. Or. Test for 2 and 15. Or. Test for 5 and 6. 31. Take the 1 millions, multiply by 2, and add to the rest. Or. Multiply the units by 3 and subtract from the rest. 32. Ignore everything from the 100,000s up, i.e. consider only the last 5 digits. 33. Test for 3 and 11. 34. Test for 2 and 17. 35. Test for 5 and 7. 36. Test for 4 and 9. 37. Take the 1000s and add to the rest. Or multiply the units by 11 and subtract from the rest. 38. Test for 2 and 19. 39. Test for 3 and 13. 40. Test for 8 and 5. 41. Take the 100,000s and add to the rest. Or multiply the units by 4 and subtract. 42. Test for 2 and 3 and 7. 43. take the 10 millions, multiply by 6, and add to the rest. Or multiply the units by 13 and add. 44, test for 4 and 11. 45, test for 9 and 5. 46, test for 2 and 23. 47, take the 10 millions, multiply by 2, and subtract from the rest. Or multiply the units by 14 and subtract. 48, test for 16 and 3. 49, take the 100s, multiply by 2, and add to the rest. Or multiply the units by 5 and add. 50, test for 2 and 25. 51, test for 3 and 17. 52, test for 4 and 13. 53, take the 1 millions, multiply by 4, and subtract from the rest. Or multiply the units by 16 and add. 54, test for 2 and 27. 55, test for 5 and 11. 56, test for 8 and 7. 57, test for 3 and 19. 58, test for 2 and 29. 59, take the 1000s, multiply by 3, and subtract from the rest. Or multiply the units by 6 and add. 60, test for 4 and 3 and 5. 61, take the 10,000s, multiply by 4, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 6 and subtract. 62, test for 2 and 31. 63, test for 9 and 7. 64, ignore everything from the 1 millions up. 65, test for 5 and 13. 66, test for 2 and 3 and 11. 67, take the 1000s, multiply by 5, and subtract from the rest. Or multiply the units by 20 and subtract. 68, test for 4 and 17. 69, test for 3 and 23. 70, test for 2 and 5 and 7. 71, take the 10 millions, multiply by 5, and add to the rest. Or multiply the units by 7 and subtract from the rest. 72, test for 8 and 9. 73, take the 10,000s and subtract from the rest. Or multiply the units by 22 and add to the rest. 74, test for 2 and 37. 75, test for 3 and 25. 76, test for 4 and 19. 77, test for 7 and 11. 78, test for 2 and 3 and 13. 79, take the 100,000s, multiply by 14, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 8 and add. 80, test for 16 and 5. 81, take the 10 millions, multiply by 17, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 8 and subtract. 82, test for 2 and 41. 83, take the 1000s, multiply by 4, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 25 and add to the rest. 84, test for 4 and 3 and 7. 85, test for 5 and 17. 86, test for 2 and 43. 87, test for 3 and 29. 88, test for 8 and 11. Take the 1 millions, multiply by 4, and subtract from the rest. Or multiply the units by 9 and add to the rest. 90, test for 2 and 9 and 5. 91, test for 7 and 13. 92, test for 4 and 23. 93, test for 3 and 31. 94, test for 2 and 47. 95, test for 5 and 19. 96, test for 32 and 3. 97, take the 100s, multiply by 3, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 29 and subtract from the rest. 98, test for 2 and 49. 99, test for 9 and 11. 100, test for 4 and 25. 101, take the 10,000s and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 10 and subtract. 102, test for 2 and 3 and 17. Take the 10,000s, multiply by 9, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 31 and add. 104, test for 8 and 13. 105, test for 3 and 5 and 7. 106, test for 2 and 53. 107, take the 10 millions, multiply by 6, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 32 and subtract. 108, test for 4 and 27. Take the 10 millions, multiply by 13, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 11 and add. 110, test for 2 and 5 and 11. 111, test for 3 and 37. 112, test for 16 and 7. 113, take the 100,000s, multiply by 5, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 34 and add to the rest. 114, test for 2 and 3 and 19. 115, test for 5 and 23. 116, test for 4 and 29. 117, test for 9 and 13. 118, test for 2 and 59. 119, test for 7 and 17. 120, test for 8 and 3 and 5. 121, multiply the units by 12 and subtract from the rest. 122, test for 2 and 61. 123, test for 3 and 41. 124, test for 4 and 31. 125, ignore everything from the 1000s up. 126, test for 2 and 9 and 7. 127, take the 1 millions, multiply by 2, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 38 and subtract from the rest. 128, ignore everything from the 10 millions up. 129, test for 3 and 43. 130, test for 2 and 5 and 13. 131. Take the 10 millions, multiply by 16, and subtract from the rest. Or multiply the units by 13 and subtract from the rest. 132, test for 4 and 3 and 11. 133, test for 7 and 19. 134, test for 2 and 67. 135, test for 27 and 5. 136, test for 8 and 17. 137, take the 10,000s and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 41 and subtract from the rest. 138, test for 2 and 3 and 23. 139, take the 10,000s, multiply by 8, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 14 and add to the rest. 140, test for 4 and 5 and 7. 141, test for 3 and 47. 142, test for 2 and 71. 143, test for 11 and 13. 144, test for 16 and 9. 145, test for 5 and 29. 146, test for 2 and 73. 147, test for 3 and 49. 148, test for 4 and 37. 149, take the 100 millions, multiply by 9, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 15 and add to the rest. 150, test for 2 and 3 and 25. 151, take the 10 millions, multiply by 25, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 15 and subtract from the rest. 152, test for 8 and 19. 153, test for 9 and 17. 154, test for 2 and 7 and 11. 155, test for 5 and 31. 156, test for 4 and 3 and 13. 157. Take the 100,000s, multiply by 9, and subtract from the rest. Or multiply the units by 47 and subtract from the rest. 158, test for 2 and 79. 159, test for 3 and 53. 160, test for 32 and 5. 161, test for 7 and 23. 162, test for 2 and 81. 163, take the 1 millions, multiply by 5, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 49 and add. 164, test for 4 and 41. 165, test for 3 and 5 and 11. 166, test for 2 and 83. 167, take the 1000s, multiply by 2, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 50 and subtract. 168, test for 8 and 3 and 7. 169, take the 100 millions, multiply by 4, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 17 and add. 170, test for 2 and 5 and 17. 171, test for 9 and 19. 172, test for 4 and 43. 173, take the 100,000s, multiply by 6, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 52 and add to the rest. 174, test for 2 and 3 and 29. 175, test for 25 and 7. 176, test for 16 and 11. 177, test for 3 and 59. 178, test for 2 and 89. 179, take the 10 millions, multiply by 14, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 18 and add. 180, test for 4 and 9 and 5. 181, take the 1 millions, multiply by 25, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 18 and subtract from the rest. 182, test for 2 and 7 and 13. 183, test for 3 and 61. 184, test for 8 and 23. 185, test for 5 and 37. 186, test for 2 and 3 and 31. 187, test for 11 and 17. 188, test for 4 and 47. 189, test for 27 and 7. 190, test for 2 and 5 and 19. 191, take the 10 millions, multiply by 4, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 19 and subtract. 192, test for 64 and 3. 193, take the 100,000s, multiply by 26, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 58 and add. 194, test for 2 and 97. 195, test for 3 and 5 and 13. 196, test for 4 and 49. 197, take the 1000s, multiply by 15, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 59 and subtract. 198, test for 2 and 9 and 11. 199, take the 1000s, multiply by 5, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 20 and add. 200, test for 8 and 25. 201, test for 3 and 67. 202, test for 2 and 101. 203, test for 7 and 29. 204, test for 4 and 3 and 17. 205, test for 5 and 41. 206, test for 2 and 103. 207, test for 9 and 23. 208, test for 16 and 13. 209, test for 11 and 19. 210, test for 2 and 3 and 5 and 7. 211, take the 100,000s, multiply by 14, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 21 and subtract. 212, test for 4 and 53. 213, test for 3 and 71. 214, test for 2 and 107. 215, test for 5 and 43. 216, test for 8 and 27. 217, test for 7 and 31. 218, test for 2 and 109. 219, test for 3 and 73. 220, test for 4 and 5 and 11. 221, test for 13 and 17. 222, test for 2 and 3 and 37. 223, take the 10 millions, multiply by 11, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 67 and add. 224, test for 32 and 7. 225, test for 9 and 25. 226, test for 2 and 113. 227, take the 10,000s, multiply by 12, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 68 and subtract. 228, test for 4 and 3 and 19. 229, take the 10 millions, multiply by 28, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 23 and add. 230, test for 2 and 5 and 23. 231, test for 3 and 7 and 11. 232, test for 8 and 29. 233, take the 10,000s, multiply by 19, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 70 and add. 234, test for 2 and 9 and 13. 235, test for 5 and 47. 236, test for 4 and 59. 237, test for 3 and 79. 238, test for 2 and 7 and 17. 239, take the 10 millions and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 24 and add. 240, test for 16 and 3 and 5. 241, take the 100,000s, multiply by 15, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 24 and subtract. 242, test for 2 and 121. 243, take the 1000s, multiply by 28, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 73 and add. 244, test for 4 and 61. 245, test for 5 and 49. 246, test for 2 and 3 and 41. 247, test for 13 and 19. 248, test for 8 and 31. 249, test for 3 and 83. 250, test for 2 and 125. 251. Take the 1000s, multiply by 4, and subtract from the rest. Or multiply the units by 25 and subtract from the rest. 252, test for 4 and 9 and 7. 253, test for 11 and 23. 254, test for 2 and 127. 255, test for 3 and 5 and 17. 256, ignore everything from the 100 millions up. 257. Take the 1 millions, multiply by 13, and add to the rest. Or multiply the units by 77 and subtract. 258, test for 2 and 3 and 43. 259, test for 7 and 37. 260, test for 4 and 5 and 13. 261, test for 9 and 29. 262, test for 2 and 131. 263. Take the 10,000s, multiply by 6, and add to the rest. Or multiply the units by 79 and add to the rest. 264, test for 8 and 3 and 11. 265, test for 5 and 53. 266, test for 2 and 7 and 19. 267, test for 3 and 89. 268, test for 4 and 67. 269, take the 10,000s, multiply by 47, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 27 and add. 270, test for 2 and 27 and 5. 271, take the 100,000s and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 27 and subtract. 272, test for 16 and 17. 273, test for 3 and 7 and 13. 274, test for 2 and 137. 275, test for 25 and 11. 276, test for 4 and 3 and 23. 277, take the 100,000s, multiply by 3, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 83 and subtract. 278, test for 2 and 139. 279, test for 9 and 31. 280, test for 8 and 5 and 7. 281, take the 100 millions, multiply by 32, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 28 and subtract. 282, test for 2 and 3 and 47. 283, take the 100 millions, multiply by 31, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 85 and add. 284, test for 4 and 71. 285, test for 3 and 5 and 19. 286, test for 2 and 11 and 13. 287, test for 7 and 41. 288, test for 32 and 9. 289, take the 100,000s, multiply by 6, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 29 and add. 290, test for 2 and 5 and 29. 291, test for 3 and 97. 292, test for 4 and 73. 293, multiply the units by 88 and add to the rest. 294, test for 2 and 3 and 49. 295, test for 5 and 59. 296, test for 8 and 37. 297, test for 27 and 11. 298, test for 2 and 149. 299, test for 13 and 23. 300, test for 4 and 3 and 25. 301, test for 7 and 43. 302, test for 2 and 151. 303, test for 3 and 101. 304, test for 16 and 19. 305, test for 5 and 61. 306, test for 2 and 9 and 17. 307, take the 100 millions, multiply by 31, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 92 and subtract. 308, test for 4 and 7 and 11. 309, test for 3 and 103. 310, test for 2 and 5 and 31. 311, take the 10,000s, multiply by 48, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 31 and subtract. 312, test for 8 and 3 and 13. 313, multiply the units by 94 and add to the rest. 314, test for 2 and 157. 315, test for 9 and 5 and 7. 316, test for 4 and 79. 317, take the 1000s, multiply by 49, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 95 and subtract from the rest. 318, test for 2 and 3 and 53. 319, test for 11 and 29. 320, test for 64 and 5. 321, test for 3 and 107. 322, test for 2 and 7 and 23. 323, test for 17 and 19. 324, test for 4 and 81. 325, test for 25 and 13. 326, test for 2 and 163. 327, test for 3 and 109. 328, test for 8 and 41. 329, test for 7 and 47. 330, test for 2 and 3 and 5 and 11. 331. Take the 1000s, multiply by 7, and add to the rest. Or multiply the units by 33 and subtract. 332, test for 4 and 83. 333, test for 9 and 37. 334, test for 2 and 167. 335, test for 5 and 67. 336, test for 16 and 3 and 7. 337. Take the 1000s, multiply by 11 and subtract from the rest. Or multiply the units by 101 and subtract. 338, test for 2 and 169. 339, test for 3 and 113. 340, test for 4 and 5 and 17. 341, test for 11 and 31. 342, test for 2 and 9 and 19. 343, take the 1000s, multiply by 29, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 103 and add. 344, test for 8 and 43. 345, test for 3 and 5 and 23. 346, test for 2 and 173. 347, take the 1000s, multiply by 41, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 104 and subtract. 348, test for 4 and 3 and 29. 349, take the 100 millions, multiply by 17, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 35 and add. 350, test for 2 and 25 and 7. 351, test for 27 and 13. 352, test for 32 and 11. 353, take the 100 millions, multiply by 42, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 106 and add. 354, test for 2 and 3 and 59. 355, test for 5 and 71. 356, test for 4 and 89. 357, test for 3 and 7 and 17. 358, test for 2 and 179. 359, take the 10,000s, multiply by 52, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 36 and add. 360, test for 8 and 9 and 5. 361, take the 100,000s, multiply by 3, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 36 and subtract. 362, test for 2 and 181. 363, test for 3 and 121. 364, test for 4 and 7 and 13. 365, test for 5 and 73. 366, test for 2 and 3 and 61. 367. Take the 10 millions, multiply by 16, and subtract from the rest. Or multiply the units by 110 and subtract. 368, test for 16 and 23. 369, test for 9 and 41. 370, test for 2 and 5 and 37. 371, test for 7 and 53. 372, test for 4 and 3 and 31. 373. Take the 1 millions, multiply by 13, and subtract from the rest. Or multiply the units by 112 and add. 374, test for 2 and 11 and 17. 375, test for 3 and 125. 376, test for 8 and 47. 377, test for 13 and 29. 378, test for 2 and 27 and 7. 378, take the 100,000s, multiply by 56, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 38 and add. 380, test for 4 and 5 and 19. 381, test for 3 and 127. 382, test for 2 and 191. 383. Take the 1 millions, multiply by 13, and subtract from the rest. Or multiply the units by 115 and add. 384, test for 128 and 3. 385, test for 5 and 7 and 11. 386, test for 2 and 193. 387, test for 9 and 43. 388, test for 4 and 97. 389, take the 10 millions, multiply by 23, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 39 and add. 390, test for 2 and 3 and 5 and 13. 391, test for 17 and 23. 392, test for 8 and 49. 393, test for 3 and 131. 394, test for 2 and 197. 395, test for 5 and 79. 396, test for 4 and 9 and 11. 397, take the 10 millions, multiply by 33, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 119 and subtract. 398, test for 2 and 199. 399, test for 3 and 7 and 19. 400, test for 16 and 25. 401, take the 10,000s, multiply by 25, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 40 and subtract. 402, test for 2 and 3 and 67. 403, test for 13 and 31. 404, test for 4 and 101. 405, test for 81 and 5. 406, test for 2 and 7 and 29. 407, test for 11 and 37. 408, test for 8 and 3 and 17. 409. Take the 1 millions, multiply by 5, and subtract from the rest. Or multiply the units by 41 and add. 410, test for 2 and 5 and 41. 411, test for 3 and 137. 412, test for 4 and 103. 413, test for 7 and 59. 414, test for 2 and 9 and 23. 415, test for 5 and 83. 416, test for 32 and 13. 417, test for 3 and 139. 418, test for 2 and 11 and 19. 419, take the 10,000s, multiply by 56, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 42 and add. 420, test for 4 and 3 and 5 and 7. 421, take the 10 millions, multiply by 13, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 42 and subtract. 422, test for 2 and 211. 423, test for 9 and 47. 424, test for 8 and 53. 425, test for 25 and 17. 426, test for 2 and 3 and 71. 427, test for 7 and 61. 428, test for 4 and 107. 429, test for 3 and 11 and 13. 430, test for 2 and 5 and 43. 431, take the 100,000s, multiply by 8, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 43 and subtract. 432, test for 16 and 27. 433, take the 100,000s, multiply by 23, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 130 and add. 434, test for 2 and 7 and 31. 435, test for 3 and 5 and 29. 436, test for 4 and 109. 437, test for 19 and 23. 438, test for 2 and 3 and 73. 439, take the 10 millions, multiply by 19, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 44 and add. 440, test for 8 and 5 and 11. 441, test for 9 and 49. 442, test for 2 and 13 and 17. 443, take the 1000s, multiply by 114, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 133 and add. 444, test for 4 and 3 and 37. 445, test for 5 and 89. 446, test for 2 and 223. 447, test for 3 and 149. 448, test for 64 and 7. 449, take the 100 millions, multiply by 67, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 45 and add. 450, test for 2 and 9 and 25. 451, test for 11 and 41. 452, test for 4 and 113. 453, test for 3 and 151. 454, test for 2 and 227. 455, test for 5 and 7 and 13. 456, test for 8 and 3 and 19. 457, take the 10,000s, multiply by 54, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 137 and subtract. 458, test for 2 and 229. 459, test for 27 and 17. 460, test for 4 and 5 and 23. 461, take the 10 millions, multiply by 12, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 46 and subtract. 462, test for 2 and 3 and 7 and 11. 463, take the 100,000s, multiply by 8, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 139 and add. 464, test for 16 and 29. 465, test for 3 and 5 and 31. 466, test for 2 and 233. 467, take the 100,000s, multiply by 62, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 140 and subtract. 468, test for 4 and 9 and 13. 469, test for 7 and 67. 470, test for 2 and 5 and 47. 471, test for 3 and 157. 472, test for 8 and 59. 473, test for 11 and 43. 474, test for 2 and 3 and 79. 475, test for 25 and 19. 476, test for 4 and 7 and 17. 477, test for 9 and 53. 478, test for 2 and 239. 479, take the 1000s, multiply by 42, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 48 and add. 480, test for 32 and 3 and 5. 481, test for 13 and 37. 482, test for 2 and 241. 483, test for 3 and 7 and 23. 484, test for 4 and 121. 485, test for 5 and 97. 486, test for 2 and 243. 487, take the 1000s, multiply by 26, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 146 and subtract. 488, test for 8 and 61. 489, test for 3 and 163. 490, test for 2 and 5 and 49. 491, take the 100 millions, multiply by 6, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 49 and subtract. 492, test for 4 and 3 and 41. 493, test for 17 and 29. 494, test for 2 and 13 and 19. 495, test for 9 and 5 and 11. 496, test for 16 and 31. 497, test for 7 and 71. 498, test for 2 and 3 and 83. 499, take the 1000s, multiply by 2, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 50 and add. 500, test for 4 and 125. 501, test for 3 and 167. 502, test for 2 and 251. 503. Take the 1000s, multiply by 6, and subtract from the rest. Or Multiply the units by 151 and add. 504, test for 8 and 9 and 7. 505, test for 5 and 101. 506, test for 2 and 11 and 23. 507, test for 3 and 169. 508, test for 4 and 127. 509, take the 1000s, multiply by 18, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 51 and add. 510, test for 2 and 3 and 5 and 17. 511, test for 7 and 73. 512, ignore everything from the 1 billions up. 513, test for 27 and 19. 514, test for 2 and 257. 515, test for 5 and 103. 516, test for 4 and 3 and 43. 517, test for 11 and 47. 518, test for 2 and 7 and 37. 519, test for 3 and 173. 520, test for 8 and 5 and 13. 521, take the 100,000s, multiply by 32, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 52 and subtract. 522, test for 2 and 9 and 29. 523, take the 1 millions, multiply by 24, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 157 and add. 524, test for 4 and 131. 525, test for 3 and 25 and 7. 526, test for 2 and 263. 527, test for 17 and 31. 528, test for 16 and 3 and 11. 529, take the 100,000s, multiply by 19, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 53 and add. 530, test for 2 and 5 and 53. 531, test for 9 and 59. 532, test for 4 and 7 and 19. 533, test for 13 and 41. 534, test for 2 and 3 and 89. 535, test for 5 and 107. 536, test for 8 and 67. 537, test for 3 and 179. 538, test for 2 and 269. 539, test for 49 and 11. 540, test for 4 and 27 and 5. 541, take the 100 millions, multiply by 63, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 54 and subtract. 542, test for 2 and 271. 543, test for 3 and 181. 544, test for 32 and 17. 545, test for 5 and 109. 546, test for 2 and 3 and 7 and 13. 547, take the 1 millions, multiply by 84, and add to the rest. Or, multiply the units by 164 and subtract. 548, test for 4 and 137. 549, test for 9 and 61. 550, test for 2 and 25 and 11. 551, test for 19 and 29. 552, test for 8 and 3 and 23. 553, test for 7 and 79. 554, test for 2 and 277. 555, test for 3 and 5 and 37. 556, test for 4 and 139. 557, take the 10,000s, multiply by 26, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 167 and subtract. 558, test for 2 and 9 and 31. 559, test for 13 and 43. 560, test for 16 and 5 and 7. 561, test for 3 and 11 and 17. 562, test for 2 and 281. 563, take the 10 millions, multiply by 6, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 169 and add. 564, test for 4 and 3 and 47. 565, test for 5 and 113. 566, test for 2 and 283. 567, test for 81 and 7. 568, test for 8 and 71. 569, take the 100 millions, multiply by 43, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 57 and add. 570, test for 2 and 3 and 5 and 19. 571, take the 100,000s, multiply by 75, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 57 and subtract. 572, test for 4 and 11 and 13. 573, test for 3 and 191. 574, test for 2 and 7 and 41. 575, test for 25 and 23. 576, test for 64 and 9. 577, take the 10 millions, multiply by 13, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 173 and subtract. 578, test for 2 and 289. 579, test for 3 and 193. 580, test for 4 and 5 and 29. 581, test for 7 and 83. 582, test for 2 and 3 and 97. 583, test for 11 and 53. 584, test for 8 and 73. 585, test for 9 and 5 and 13. 586, test for 2 and 293. 587, take the 10,000s, multiply by 21, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 176 and subtract. 588, test for 4 and 3 and 49. 589, test for 19 and 31. 590, test for 2 and 5 and 59. 591, test for 3 and 197. 592, test for 16 and 37. 593, take the 100 millions, multiply by 38, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 178 and add. 594, test for 2 and 27 and 11. 595, test for 5 and 7 and 17. 596, test for 4 and 149. 597, test for 3 and 199. 598, test for 2 and 13 and 23. 599, take the 100,000s, multiply by 33, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 60 and add. 600, test for 8 and 3 and 25. 601, take the 10 millions, multiply by 39, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 60 and subtract. 602, test for 2 and 7 and 43. 603, test for 9 and 67. 604, test for 4 and 151. 605, test for 5 and 121. 606, test for 2 and 3 and 101. 607, take the 100,000s, multiply by 155, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 182 and subtract. 608, test for 32 and 19. 609, test for 3 and 7 and 29. 610, test for 2 and 5 and 61. 611, test for 13 and 47. 612, test for 4 and 9 and 17. 613, take the 100,000s, multiply by 81, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 184 and add. 614, test for 2 and 307. 615, test for 3 and 5 and 41. 616, test for 8 and 7 and 11. 617, take the 100,000s, multiply by 46, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 185 and subtract. 618, test for 2 and 3 and 103. 619, take the 10 millions, multiply by 55, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 62 and add. 620, test for 4 and 5 and 31. 621, test for 27 and 23. 622, test for 2 and 311. 623, test for 7 and 89. 624, test for 16 and 3 and 13. 625, ignore everything from the 10,000s up. 626, test for 2 and 313. 627, test for 3 and 11 and 19. 628, test for 4 and 157. 629, test for 17 and 37. 630, test for 2 and 9 and 5 and 7. 631, take the 10 millions, multiply by 88, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 63 and subtract. 632, test for 8 and 79. 633, test for 3 and 211. 634, test for 2 and 317. 635, test for 5 and 127. 636, test for 4 and 3 and 53. 637, test for 49 and 13. 638, test for 2 and 11 and 29. 639, test for 9 and 71. 640, test for 128 and 5. 641 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 100,000s, multiply by 4, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 64 and subtract. 642, test for 2 and 3 and 107. 643 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 100 millions, multiply by 3, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 193 and add. 644, test for 4 and 7 and 23. 645, test for 3 and 5 and 43. 646, test for 2 and 17 and 19. 647 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 10 millions, multiply by 32, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 194 and subtract. 648, test for 8 and 81. 649, test for 11 and 59. 650, test for 2 and 25 and 13. 651, test for 3 and 7 and 31. 652, test for 4 and 163. 653 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 10 millions, multiply by 42, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 196 and add. 654, test for 2 and 3 and 109. 655, test for 5 and 131. 656, test for 16 and 41. 657, test for 9 and 73. 658, test for 2 and 7 and 47. 659 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 100 millions, multiply by 45, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 66 and add. 660, test for 4 and 3 and 5 and 11. 661 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 100 millions, multiply by 46, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 66 and subtract. 662, test for 2 and 331. 663, test for 3 and 13 and 17. 664, test for 8 and 83. 665, test for 5 and 7 and 19. 666, test for 2 and 9 and 37. 667, test for 23 and 29. 668, test for 4 and 167. 669, test for 3 and 223. 670, test for 2 and 5 and 67. 671, test for 11 and 61. 672, test for 32 and 3 and 7. 673 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1 millions, multiply by 78, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 202 and add. 674, test for 2 and 337. 675, test for 27 and 25. 676, test for 4 and 169. 677 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 10 millions, multiply by 33, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 203 and subtract. 678, test for 2 and 3 and 113. 679, test for 7 and 97. 680, test for 8 and 5 and 17. 681, test for 3 and 227. 682, test for 2 and 11 and 31. 683 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 100 millions, multiply by 79, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 205 and add. 684, test for 4 and 9 and 19. 685, test for 5 and 137. 686, test for 2 and 343. 687, test for 3 and 229. 688, test for 16 and 43. 689, test for 13 and 53. 690, test for 2 and 3 and 5 and 23. 691 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1 millions, multiply by 123, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 69 and subtract. 692, test for 4 and 173. 693, test for 9 and 7 and 11. 694, test for 2 and 347. 695, test for 5 and 139. 696, test for 8 and 3 and 29. 697, test for 17 and 41. 698, test for 2 and 349. 699, test for 3 and 233. 700, test for 4 and 25 and 7. 701 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 10,000s, multiply by 186, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 70 and subtract. 702, test for 2 and 27 and 13. 703, test for 19 and 37. 704, test for 64 and 11. 705, test for 3 and 5 and 47. 706, test for 2 and 353. 707, test for 7 and 101. 708, test for 4 and 3 and 59. 709 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 100,000s, multiply by 31, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 71 and add. 710, test for 2 and 5 and 71. 711, test for 9 and 79. 712, test for 8 and 89. 713, test for 23 and 31. 714, test for 2 and 3 and 7 and 17. 715, test for 5 and 11 and 13. 716, test for 4 and 179. 717, test for 3 and 239. 718, test for 2 and 359. 719 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 100 millions, multiply by 42, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 72 and add. 720, test for 16 and 9 and 5. 721, test for 7 and 103. 722, test for 2 and 361. 723, test for 3 and 241. 724, test for 4 and 181. 725, test for 25 and 29. 726, test for 2 and 3 and 121. 727 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 10 millions, multiply by 115, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 218 and subtract. 728, test for 8 and 7 and 13. 729 is 3 to the power of 6 and has the tests. Take the 100,000s, multiply by 127, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 73 and add. 730, test for 2 and 5 and 73. 731, test for 17 and 43. 732, test for 4 and 3 and 61. 733 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1 millions, multiply by 188, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 220 and add. 734, test for 2 and 367. 735, test for 3 and 5 and 49. 736, test for 32 and 23. 737, test for 11 and 67. 738, test for 2 and 9 and 41. 739 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 100 millions, multiply by 2, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 74 and add. 740, test for 4 and 5 and 37. 741, test for 3 and 13 and 19. 742, test for 2 and 7 and 53. 743 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 10 millions, multiply by 37, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 223 and add. 744, test for 8 and 3 and 31. 745, test for 5 and 149. 746, test for 2 and 373. 747, test for 9 and 83. 748, test for 4 and 11 and 17. 749, test for 7 and 107. 750, test for 2 and 3 and 125. 751 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 100,000s, multiply by 117, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 75 and subtract. 752, test for 16 and 47. 753, test for 3 and 251. 754, test for 2 and 13 and 29. 755, test for 5 and 151. 756, test for 4 and 27 and 7. 757 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1 millions, multiply by 3, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 227 and subtract. 758, test for 2 and 379. 759, test for 3 and 11 and 23. 760, test for 8 and 5 and 19. 761 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 100 millions, multiply by 34, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 76 and subtract. 762, test for 2 and 3 and 127. 763, test for 7 and 109. 764, test for 4 and 191. 765, test for 9 and 5 and 17. 766, test for 2 and 383. 767, test for 13 and 59. 768, test for 256 and 3. 769 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 10,000s, multiply by 3, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 77 and add. 770, test for 2 and 5 and 7 and 11. 771, test for 3 and 257. 772, test for 4 and 193. 773 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 10,000s, multiply by 49, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 232 and add. 774, test for 2 and 9 and 43. 775, test for 25 and 31. 776, test for 8 and 97. 777, test for 3 and 7 and 37. 778, test for 2 and 389. 779, test for 19 and 41. 780, test for 4 and 3 and 5 and 13. 781, test for 11 and 71. 782, test for 2 and 17 and 23. 783, test for 27 and 29. 784, test for 16 and 49. 785, test for 5 and 157. 786, test for 2 and 3 and 131. 787 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 100,000s, multiply by 51, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 236 and subtract. 788, test for 4 and 197. 789, test for 3 and 263. 790, test for 2 and 5 and 79. 791, test for 7 and 113. 792, test for 8 and 9 and 11. 793, test for 13 and 61. 794, test for 2 and 397. 795, test for 3 and 5 and 53. 796, test for 4 and 199. 797 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 10 millions, multiply by 41, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 239 and subtract. 798, test for 2 and 3 and 7 and 19. 799, test for 17 and 47. 800, test for 32 and 25. 801, test for 9 and 89. 802, test for 2 and 401. 803, test for 11 and 73. 804, test for 4 and 3 and 67. 805, test for 5 and 7 and 23. 806, test for 2 and 13 and 31. 807, test for 3 and 269. 808, test for 8 and 101. 809 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 10 millions, multiply by 49, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 81 and add. 810, test for 2 and 81 and 5. 811 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1 millions, multiply by 37, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 81 and subtract. 812, test for 4 and 7 and 29. 813, test for 3 and 271. 814, test for 2 and 11 and 37. 815, test for 5 and 163. 816, test for 16 and 3 and 17. 817, test for 19 and 43. 818, test for 2 and 409. 819, test for 9 and 7 and 13. 820, test for 4 and 5 and 41. 821 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1 millions, multiply by 22, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 82 and subtract. 822, test for 2 and 3 and 137. 823 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1 millions, multiply by 55, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 247 and add. 824, test for 8 and 103. 825, test for 3 and 25 and 11. 826, test for 2 and 7 and 59. 827 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 100 millions, multiply by 13, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 248 and subtract. 828, test for 4 and 9 and 23. 829 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 10,000s, multiply by 52, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 83 and add. 830, test for 2 and 5 and 83. 831, test for 3 and 277. 832, test for 64 and 13. 833, test for 49 and 17. 834, test for 2 and 3 and 139. 835, test for 5 and 167. 836, test for 4 and 11 and 19. 837, test for 27 and 31. 838, test for 2 and 419. 839 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 10 millions, multiply by 41, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 84 and add. 840, test for 8 and 3 and 5 and 7. 841 is 29 squared and has the tests. Take the 1 millions, multiply by 51, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 84 and subtract. 842, test for 2 and 421. 843, test for 3 and 281. 844, test for 4 and 211. 845, test for 5 and 169. 846, test for 2 and 9 and 47. 847, test for 7 and 121. 848, test for 16 and 53. 849, test for 3 and 283. 850, test for 2 and 25 and 17. 851, test for 23 and 37. 852, test for 4 and 3 and 71. 853 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1000s, multiply by 147, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 256 and add. 854, test for 2 and 7 and 61. 855, test for 9 and 5 and 19. 856, test for 8 and 107. 857 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 100 millions, multiply by 98, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 257 and subtract. 858, test for 2 and 3 and 11 and 13. 859 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1 millions, multiply by 124, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 86 and add. 860, test for 4 and 5 and 43. 861, test for 3 and 7 and 41. 862, test for 2 and 431. 863 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 100,000s, multiply by 108, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 259 and add. 864, test for 32 and 27. 865, test for 5 and 173. 866, test for 2 and 433. 867, test for 3 and 289. 868, test for 4 and 7 and 31. 869, test for 11 and 79. 870, test for 2 and 3 and 5 and 29. 871, test for 13 and 67. 872, test for 8 and 109. 873, test for 9 and 97. 874, test for 2 and 19 and 23. 875, test for 125 and 7. 876, test for 4 and 3 and 73. 877 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 100,000s, multiply by 22, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 263 and subtract. 878, test for 2 and 439. 879, test for 3 and 293. 880, test for 16 and 5 and 11. 881 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1 millions, multiply by 65, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 88 and subtract. 882, test for 2 and 9 and 49. 883 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 10 millions, multiply by 25, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 265 and add. 884, test for 4 and 13 and 17. 885, test for 3 and 5 and 59. 886, test for 2 and 443. 887 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 10 millions, multiply by 38, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 266 and subtract. 888, test for 8 and 3 and 37. 889, test for 7 and 127. 890, test for 2 and 5 and 89. 891, test for 81 and 11. 892, test for 4 and 223. 893, test for 19 and 47. 894, test for 2 and 3 and 149. 895, test for 5 and 179. 896, test for 128 and 7. 897, test for 3 and 13 and 23. 898, test for 2 and 449. 899, test for 29 and 31. 900, test for 4 and 9 and 25. 901, test for 17 and 53. 902, test for 2 and 11 and 41. 903, test for 3 and 7 and 43. 904, test for 8 and 113. 905, test for 5 and 181. 906, test for 2 and 3 and 151. 907 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 10,000s, multiply by 23, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 272 and subtract. 908, test for 4 and 227. 909, test for 9 and 101. 910, test for 2 and 5 and 7 and 13. 911 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 10,000s, multiply by 21, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 91 and subtract. 912, test for 16 and 3 and 19. 913, test for 11 and 83. 914, test for 2 and 457. 915, test for 3 and 5 and 61. 916, test for 4 and 229. 917, test for 7 and 131. 918, test for 2 and 27 and 17. 919 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 100 millions, multiply by 66, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 92 and add. 920, test for 8 and 5 and 23. 921, test for 3 and 307. 922, test for 2 and 461. 923, test for 13 and 71. 924, test for 4 and 3 and 7 and 11. 925, test for 25 and 37. 926, test for 2 and 463. 927, test for 9 and 103. 928, test for 32 and 29. 929 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1000s, multiply by 71, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 93 and add. 930, test for 2 and 3 and 5 and 31. 931, test for 49 and 19. 932, test for 4 and 233. 933, test for 3 and 311. 934, test for 2 and 467. 935, test for 5 and 11 and 17. 936, test for 8 and 9 and 13. 937 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1000s, multiply by 63, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 281 and subtract. 938, test for 2 and 7 and 67. 939, test for 3 and 313. 940, test for 4 and 5 and 47. 941 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 10 millions, multiply by 7, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 94 and subtract. 942, test for 2 and 3 and 157. 943, test for 23 and 41. 944, test for 16 and 59. 945, test for 27 and 5 and 7. 946, test for 2 and 11 and 43. 947 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1 millions, multiply by 32, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 284 and subtract. 948, test for 4 and 3 and 79. 949, test for 13 and 73. 950, test for 2 and 25 and 19. 951, test for 3 and 317. 952, test for 8 and 7 and 17. 953 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1000s, multiply by 47, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 286 and add. 954, test for 2 and 9 and 53. 955, test for 5 and 191. 956, test for 4 and 239. 957, test for 3 and 11 and 29. 958, test for 2 and 479. 959, test for 7 and 137. 960, test for 64 and 3 and 5. 961 is 31 squared and has the tests. Take the 1000s, multiply by 39, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 96 and subtract. 962, test for 2 and 13 and 37. 963, test for 9 and 107. 964, test for 4 and 241. 965, test for 5 and 193. 966, test for 2 and 3 and 7 and 23. 967 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1000s, multiply by 33, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 290 and subtract. 968, test for 8 and 121. 969, test for 3 and 17 and 19. 970, test for 2 and 5 and 97. 971 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 100,000s, multiply by 13, and subtract from the rest. Multiply the units by 97 and subtract. 972, test for 4 and 243. 973, test for 7 and 139. 974, test for 2 and 487. 975, test for 3 and 25 and 13. 976, test for 16 and 61. 977 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1000s, multiply by 23, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 293 and subtract. 978, test for 2 and 3 and 163. 979, test for 11 and 89. 980, test for 4 and 5 and 49. 981, test for 9 and 109. 982, test for 2 and 491. 983 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1000s, multiply by 17, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 295 and add. 984, test for 8 and 3 and 41. 985, test for 5 and 197. 986, test for 2 and 17 and 29. 987, test for 3 and 7 and 47. 988, test for 4 and 13 and 19. 989, test for 23 and 43. 990, test for 2 and 9 and 5 and 11. 991 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1000s, multiply by 9, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 99 and subtract. 992, test for 32 and 31. 993, test for 3 and 331. 994, test for 2 and 7 and 71. 995, test for 5 and 199. 996, test for 4 and 3 and 83. 997 is a prime and has the tests. Take the 1000s, multiply by 3, and add to the rest. Multiply the units by 299 and subtract. 998, test for 2 and 499. 999, test for 27 and 37. The last three digits are 000. Or test for 8 and 125.